Good afternoon. My name is Annalisa Molini and I'm an associate professor in civil infrastructure and environmental engineering at Khalifa University. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you today to this afternoon's webinar that is part of the Khalifa University outreach cycle. The focus of the seminar today will be soil salinization. In particular, we will explore how soil salinization that can be considered a form of land degradation can affect water resources, their availability and climate. And in doing so, we will also explore the connection and the interaction between climate and vegetation. And we will look into how salinity and salt in the soil and the soil water can affect this interaction. The one of today is mainly an overview of the methods and the tools and models that can be used to address the soil salinization issue. I will try at my best also to put these results and methods in the context of the research that has been done in the recent years at Khalifa University. So let's start as first to define what soil salinization is. Soil salinization is essentially the accumulation of excess salt in the soil, and as a result of this process we have a partial or complete loss of soil productivity and impairment of plant functioning. Soil salinization can be of two kinds. It can be natural, in this case it's called primary salinization, or it can be human-induced, and in this case it's called secondary salinization. It is mostly widespread in arid and semi-arid regions for climatic reasons, and here it represents a huge threat to the food security of this region. But actually we can find saline environments and salinization across a very wide spectrum of climates worldwide. In the next slide I will try to give you an introduction to these very different environments that can be characterized as saline environments. So I don't like categories, but still saline environments can be mostly divided in two categories that are wet saline environments and dry saline environments. They have different characteristics but also a lot in common. Wet saline environments, what they are? I mean, they are tidal wetlands, mangrove swamps, marshes, all these ecosystems and ecotones, let's say, that we can find at the interface between land and sea. And why they're important? They are extremely important because they are a crucial component of the global carbon cycle, because they represent a carbon sink. They can accumulate and store carbon in their sediments and biomass. So there has been a lot of attention for this environment recently, essentially for this reason. At the very end of the spectrum, on the other side, we have dry saline environments. These dry saline environments are essentially dry lands affected by different kinds of salinization, primary or secondary or mixed or two. And why they are important? They are important because when we look into agriculture in arid and semi-arid regions, salinization is always a part of the picture and is affecting the way in which agriculture can be developed in a sustainable way in these regions. So they are crucial for this reason. Looking close to home, we have both wet saline environments and dry saline environments in the UAE. We have essentially coastal mangroves that represent the only forest, natural forest that we have here in the UAE. And these are unique ecosystems that are able to endure the most harsh environmental conditions, extreme temperature, extreme salinity, absence of nutrients, and they are an exceptional benchmark to understand what an ecosystem can go through in extreme saline conditions. At the other side, we have dry saline environments that are omnipresent in the region. A recent study that is using essentially remotely sensed data is indicating that roughly 40% of the land surface here in the UAE is already highly affected by soil salinization, while roughly 80% is at some extent already affected. So here, the problem of soil salinization is really a huge problem, especially considering the efforts that has been done in the country to establish a sustainable agriculture effort and to have a local produce for local consumption. So this is the picture, and the global picture is not pink as well. Soil salinization is a huge problem and is a global problem. It has a large impact on crop productivity and plant functioning in general, so the resilience of ecosystems themselves. The recent estimate using FAO data is indicating that salt-affected soils account for roughly 1.1 gigahectares worldwide. This corresponds roughly to 10% of the total land surface of our planet. And you have to consider that 1 gigahectare is something like 1 billion hectares. So it's a huge amount of land that is potentially impacted by soil salinization and is not fertile as will be without salt. On the other side, the process is on the rise. So in arid regions alone, about 2,000 hectares of arable land are lost daily to soil salinization. And this is, of course, a situation that is calling for some kind of mitigation intervention. And many solutions, of course, have been proposed, starting from the simplest one that are related to have a better drainage of agricultural land. One solution that has been proposed in the recent decades is the one of using salt-tolerant species, halophytes, for agriculture in salt-affected soils. However, it's important to consider that the response of these, let's call them new crops, and their interaction with climate and water resources is very different from the one that we have seen for traditional crops that are salt-sensitive. And so a lot of questions remain open about the feasibility of this kind of approach, and they need to be answered through, of course, the right tools and right models and the right understanding of the process. So, to look in how salinity is affecting crops and water resources, we have to start with the interaction between vegetation, climate, and the water cycle. This interaction is extremely complex and includes different components. There is, of course, an energetic component, a purely hydrological component, and a biogeochemical component. So the main component in terms of energy fluxes that is impacted by the interaction between vegetation and climate. So the fact that vegetation is essentially having some sort of feedback on climate and water resources is the component of the latent heat fluxes. Latent heat fluxes are a way to transfer energy from Earth's surface to the atmosphere, and they are mainly associated with evaporation and transpiration. So, what is making these fluxes particularly important is that while we are transferring through evaporation or transpiration through plants water from the soils to the atmosphere, the water goes through a phase change and it moves from the liquid phase to the vapor phase. And during this process, temperature is not altered. So this mechanism to transfer energy to the atmosphere is not rising the temperature of the atmosphere. This is why very often the concept of evaporative cooling is associated with transpiration. Now, if we look at the problem from the purely hydrological point of view, still evaporation and transpiration are there, but they are a mere component of the hydrological cycle and the partitioning of precipitation in the hydrological cycle. And again, we have that essentially plants are a tool to extract water from the soil through roots and to move this water to the atmosphere through transpiration across the stomata of the leaves. In this process, when the stomata on the leaves, that are these small holes that you have on the leaves that are allowing water vapor to go out, are open, CO2 is entering the leaf, and CO2 is used for photosynthesis. So you can imagine that the hydrological component that we have here is strictly connected also with the biogeochemical component, that is the one of fixing carbon into the biomass through photosynthesis. So these are the basic concepts, and how salinity is affecting these three perspective of three components of the vegetation-climate interaction. Well, the key process to consider here is the osmotic effects in the soil that salinity is triggering, lowering the water potential and creating stronger gradients that are not allowing to the roots of the plants to extract water from the soil and to transfer it to the atmosphere. And essentially, the fact is that through salt in the soil, you are going to limit the latent heat fluxes, lowering them. You are going to impair evapotranspiration, lowering both the evaporative component and the transpiration one. And of course, you have also an impact on the carbon fixation, because a plant that is under water stress, and this can be defined, and we will see it better later, as a water stress, is also fixing less carbon, is less productive. So far we have seen that soil salinization is a global environmental issue that can influence a different range of environments and ecosystem across a wide spectrum of climatic regimes. And finally, in the last slide, we have seen that soil salinization can affect the interaction between vegetation and climate in different ways and through different pathways. It can influence the energetic aspects of this interaction, it can affect the hydrological aspects of this interaction, and it can also affect the biogeochemical aspects of this interaction. Now, the next question that we should put to ourselves is how we can model, how we can reproduce the effect of soil salinization on plant-water relations and vegetation-climate interactions. The modeling of these interactions, being soil salinization a multi-scale process, a process that is operating at very different temporal spatial scales, needs to go through a multi-scale approach. And in particular, we will have to formulate models at different scales depending on the specific issue we have to address. We may, for example, formulate plant-scale models incorporating the fluid dynamics of plants, the fluid dynamics in the xylem and in the phloem, and the osmoregulatory strategies that plants at the plant scale are putting in place to resist, to survive soil stress. And we may go upscale and incorporate ecosystem scale processes that include, of course, the response of the ecosystem as a whole. And further upscaling, we may need models that are looking into the long-term response of basin and subregional scales to soil salinization, and are trying to reproduce the long-term energy and water balance at these scales. So all these ingredients are needed to understand the process. And when we speak about models, most of the time in climate sciences we think about climate models that are these big machineries built to predict our climate also 100 years ahead. Climate models are nowadays going through a huge transformation, and they're moving from the purely physical approach of the early stage climate models to the concept of Earth system models that are including not only the physical processes but also the biophysical processes, the biogeophysical processes, and the biogeochemistry of the process itself. So in these models there is of course room to incorporate also the effects of soil salinization, and in particular the interaction between vegetation and the water cycle through the modulation of evapotranspiration operated by soil salinity, the effects of soil salinity on photosynthesis, and also the effect of salinity on how vegetation can interact with the soil and soil water and the atmosphere, and essentially reproduce all those processes that are feedback of vegetation on climate and the water cycle. Now, this task is not easy. A number of approaches have been implemented to deal with the parameterization of plant traits and vegetation characteristics in Earth system models, and there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. Of course, vegetation models are now incorporated in the land atmosphere modules of Earth system models, but well, they are going through a continuous reformulation and continuous improvement, while of course also our computational capabilities are increasing. Again, the key idea that we have to keep in mind in addressing this kind of issues is that the problem is a multi-scale problem, and to incorporate all these different scales require to have models that describes these different temporal and spatial scales. Now, there are different efforts that are trying to incorporate the biosphere in climate models, and there are different ongoing efforts trying to incorporate the effect of soil and soil water salinity and salt plant tolerance in Earth system models. And Khalifa University is also part of one of these efforts. We're part of a project that is funded by the US Department of Energy of the United States of America. We're collaborating with the University of Texas at Austin, Princeton University, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And we are trying to construct parameterization for salt-resilient vegetation in Earth system model, in particular for coastal wetlands and mangrove systems. So, but we are not really the only group that is working on these topics now. There are several groups that are working on this topic now. Why? Because again, it's extremely important to understand the effects of salinity and salt tolerance on climate and water resources. In the last part of this presentation, I will introduce you some examples of models and tools that can be used to understand, to study, and to predict the effects of salinity on different plant species, different ecosystems, and at larger scales on different environments. So we will start with the plant scales. I will not go into details here. What I want to provide you with is essentially a general view of the ideas and the concepts that are behind this kind of tools and models. So models that are used at the plant scales are usually soil plant atmosphere continuum models. In my group, we developed a series of these soil plant atmosphere continuum model that were taking into account also salinity. The most recent one is a model that is mimicking osmoregulation in plants. So all these processes through which plants are able to regulate the concentration of salt inside the plants. And this osmoregulation is reproduced through the interaction between the xylem and the phloem, that are the two main pipelines that you can find inside the plants. Okay, the xylem is essentially the vascular tissue in plants which transport water from the roots to the leaves. So the one that is responsible for transpiration. And then we have the phloem, that is the living tissue that is transporting soluble organic compounds that are produced during photosynthesis, mainly sucrose, from the sources, again, that are leaves, to the sinks that are roots and other organs in the plants. So through the hydraulic coupling of these two pipelines that have very different sections, very different roughness characteristics, very different hydraulic characteristics, you can reproduce the ways through which plants are able to maintain a certain concentration of salt inside the plants and can withstand essentially high levels of salinity. If coupled with a suitable carbon optimization, for example, scheme, this kind of models can help us to understand how the individual plant can respond to environmental forcings of different kinds. In particular, here I have an example that is about carbon enrichment. We all know that under climate change, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, so atmospheric carbon, will increase. And different kind of plants with different kinds of sensitivity to salt in the soil could have different response under carbon enrichment in the future. Here there is the example of Rhizophora mangrove, that is a mangrove, so it's salt resilient, and Holle europea, olive, that is not particularly salt resilient, it is a sensitive plant. So these plots are showing the assimilation rate, FC, that is a measure for how much carbon you can fix as a function of the concentration of salt in the soil, and the transpiration as a function of concentration of salt in the soils for different carbon enrichment scenarios. And we start with the thinner line that refers to present conditions that are 400 ppms of CO2, and we go up to 500 ppms. What we see that in terms of carbon assimilation, of course, is that if the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing, also carbon assimilation for different conditions of salinity is increasing. Even if at very high salinities, of course, plants start to suffer so much that they cannot assimilate anymore, and this kind of gain is totally lost. But the big difference between salt-tolerant and salt-sensitive plants in this case is, for example, that transpiration is totally different in salt-tolerant and salt-sensitive plants. In particular, salt-tolerant plants are able to fix more carbon for a molecule of water, so they are more water use efficient. And so under future climate change scenarios, under future carbon enrichment, atmospheric carbon enrichment scenarios, they may be favored respect to salt-sensitive plants. This is just an example to tell you how you can use this kind of models. So we can move to the crop scale. At the crop scale, we use very different models. We don't look into the details of the fluid dynamics inside the plants, but we started to have an approach that is a LAMP approach, and we work most of the time with the stochastic water balance models, in which the stochastic forcing comes from precipitation. In this kind of models, the response of vegetation, crops or ecosystem to salinity is reproduced through the response in terms of evapotranspiration, LAMP evapotranspiration, to salinity increase. And you can formulate different functions for these relations. There are very simple functions like this one that is just a stepwise function with the threshold at a certain salinity and then a decrease in transpiration above a certain salinity, that can be used to fit the model and solve these stochastic equations. I will not go into the details again, to obtain the behavior of the system in the long term under certain under a given forcing in terms of salinity in the soil. What you can do with this model? So with this model you can do a lot of things. You can see how in long terms plants are using water, but you can also see, considering of course a coupled dynamics of salt in the soil and water in the soil, what is happening in terms of salinization in time. So here you have, for example, patterns of salt concentration in the soil over a year for different climatic regimes, semi-arid versus arid, and for different kinds of salt tolerance. We range between low tolerance plants, black lines, solid black lines, and we go up to highly tolerant plants that are having also an uptake of salt from the soil. So plants that are able to remove part of the salt from the soil. The behavior of these plants is very different, and the thing that we can notice both in semi-arid and arid environments is that these kind of characteristics, salt tolerance characteristics, are reflecting in the salinity patterns. I will try to be more clear. If you look, for example, in arid climates, you will see that the concentration of salt in the soil is increasing with salt tolerance. What does it mean? That salt tolerant plants are in general transpirating more because they are more efficient in the use of water under saline conditions. In this way, they are not favoring leaching events, and so they are not favoring the removal of salt from the soil. So essentially, they are creating a niche from themselves in the environment, and they are keeping the level of salinity higher through these strategies. This is a way in which they create an ecological niche also. So this is an interesting approach that you can use to study, for example, how species compete and how different crops are modifying the soils and are enhancing or not salinization in the soil. Similar approach can be used also for wet environments, not for crops in arid and semi-arid regions like before, but in wetlands, coastal wetlands. Here, of course, we have groundwater-dependent ecosystem, and in this case, the effects of salinity through transpiration will reflect on the position of the water table. So, for example, in this kind of environments, using similar model, you can see that different plants with different levels of salt tolerance exert different controls on the depth of the water table, and in particular salt tolerant plants that can continue to transpirate also under saline conditions, extremely saline, elevated salinity in the soils, can maintain a lower water table than salt-sensitive plants, with implication for the survival of one species with respect to the other. Of course, if the water table is getting shallower, this is going to impact salt-sensitive plants and to trigger higher mortality for this kind of species. To conclude this presentation, I want to mention also the basin scale. What are basins? Basins are the basic hydrological units on which we can define a close hydrological balance, and define also precipitation partitioning. So essentially, if we have a certain amount of precipitation that is falling over a basin, part of this precipitation will be converted in runoff, part of this will be converted in percolation, and a part will evaporate and transpirate. So this is the partitioning. Where salinity is acting on this partitioning, essentially modifying this partitioning and creating an imbalance. We've seen that salinity is essentially affecting transpiration. So lowering transpiration on a close balance implies that you are increasing other components of the balance, like for example runoff or percolation. So the water that is not used for evaporation is going to be converted in another branch of the hydrological cycle. And this is a very important point, because when we look at land-atmosphere interactions, to lose this fraction of evapotranspiration due to salinity is equating also to lose part of evaporative cooling and lose part of the effects that we will expect in a soil that is not saline from evapotranspiration. So, if we look at the problem at the basin scale, and it's very practical because on the basin you can close the balance, and if you do this kind of exercise using stochastic water balance models at the global scale, or over continents like we did in a recent publication over Australia, that is a highly saline environment affected both by primary salinization and secondary salinization. You can see that the effect of salinity is to modulate land-atmosphere interaction, to change radically land-atmosphere interaction, changing the partitioning of water, and as a consequence, also the energy balance at the basin scale. You remember that at a certain point in a slide I was discussing about how salinity is affecting vegetation, climate interaction from an energetic, water and biogeochemical perspective. Well, if you, of course, lower transpiration from the soils due to salinity, you also lower latent heat fluxes. And with this you have implication also on the energy balance of the atmosphere. So this was just to tell you that using different kind of models at different scales, you can address different issues that can be, for example, issues at the plant scales, how plants are osmoregulating and responding individually to salinity, that are problems that can be at the crop and the ecosystem scale, how the ecosystem is responding, how the ecosystem dynamics is affected by salinity, and how the crop dynamic and productivity is affected by salinity. And larger scale salinity-driven problems like how salinity is affecting land-atmosphere interaction, how salinity is affecting climate. So to conclude, these are the three main scales that we expect to find and to have to incorporate in models in the future. So we will have, of course, to deal with the plant-water-salinity interaction at the plant scales, and consider that plant scale models are providing us with the basic machinery to deal with the mechanicistic representation of short-term physiological processes inside plants. We will have to deal with what is happening at the scales of the ecosystem and the crop scale. For example, we have seen that with this kind of models, you can look in how vegetation is able to affect salinization itself and have feedbacks on salinization depending on salt tolerance. And also we have seen that, well, different kind of salt tolerance corresponds to different kind of resilience and suitability to become a dominant species in a given environment under saline conditions. At the basin scale, I put this as example that, I didn't go a lot in deep here, but it was just again to convey an idea. We can see that this kind of models are required to understand how, in the long term, over larger scales, the effects of salinity are going to impact land-atmosphere interaction, precipitation, hydrological partitioning, and the energy budget at the surface. There are open questions, of course. The integration of all these approaches to the model is not trivial. The upscaling of ecosystem basin scale models to the regional and global scales is also not trivial. To understand how different populations can compete under different salinity regimes is another open question. And there is a basic question that is particularly important here in the UE, that to understand this kind of processes is necessary in the future to establish a reliable observational network for the monitoring of vegetation-water climate relation in saline but also in non-saline environments, because this information is required to construct and parameterize these models. So this is essentially the wrap-up of our presentation today. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and this short overview of what's going on in the field. And of course, I'm ready to take questions. Thank you so much.